hanging on the old barbed wire, hanging on the old barbed wire.
What I wanted to talk to you about today is a subject that's quite close to me, my heart really. I've often said on previous talks that if I was to have one more day on a battlefield, it would be Gallipoli. I've been studying it for now 40 years, I should think, and I'm only 51. So it's ever since I first heard about Gallipoli, and I first heard about it because my great-grandmother on her sideboard had carved one of these engraved shells to a relative of mine that was killed at Suvla Bay, and it was to my Uncle George in the 5th Norfolks, and some of you would be aware of the story of the vanishing battalion and the Norfolks that disappeared, and my uncle served with those. And so it was always a far-off dream of my own to visit Gallipoli, and I managed to achieve that in the early 1990s. At that time it was a huge militarised zone. You couldn't go anywhere. We weren't allowed down onto W Beach, for instance, because there was an anti-aircraft battalion or unit on the headland there. So a lot of restricted movement, and I left. I remember leaving with a real sort of sadness that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime chance to go. And also I found that I left with more questions than answers. I've now been to Gallipoli 65, 70 times. That's just by counting up the visa stamps in your passport that they still give you. I still have more questions than answers. And that's quite incredible, really, that this is a standalone war within a war. And so when I, like many of you, undertook the master's course that was being run, and even at that level I was being told, oh, Gallipoli, it's a put in a box marked Churchill's folly and move on. I felt that wasn't right. And so it's developed over a few years, and what we're going to see today is there is a serious side to the talk today, because I want to get across exactly what was the involvement of these Gallipoli men in 1918, in the last year of the war. But because you don't want to listen to an academic reading from a paper, we're going to use a number of characters with fascinating stories to kind of prove that point. Okay, so hopefully none of you will fall asleep throughout there. So that's why you can call whatever title you want, but you really, that Dardanelles to Victory, this was the name of the paper I wrote. That's why that stuck there, David. So, and there you can see two fairly famous photographs you may have seen before. The one on your right is the entrance to Gully Ravine, which is a sizable encampment. The whole of Gully Ravine is where the men of Gallipoli, certainly in the British members of the Expeditionary Force out there, lived. It's a fascinating place to visit, absolutely fascinating. So that's Gully Ravine, and then more famously, you can see on the left there is the Rickervale Bridge, the bridge intact crossing the Hindenburg Line on the 28th, 29th of September 1918 in the advance to victory. So the two ends of the spear, if you like, of the campaign. So Gallipoli, why, first off? It's never been more relevant than today. When we see all of the unrest in Syria that we've seen in recent years, and we think about the Russians meddling in that area in Syria, we need to remember that the Russians have heavily invested in a multi-billion-pound naval base on the coast of Syria that requires a stable Assad government. And the reason their naval base is there is because without it, they need to use the Dardanelles Straits to get out from the Black Sea. And as of 2022, 2023, the Turks, it's the end of the treaty, and the Turks are able to start to charge shipping every ship that goes up and down the Straits. So it's international waters, but managed by them, and they can charge you to use it, that sort of thing. So it's really important today, strategically massively important. I got up here today 2 hours early, and because I didn't trust my good friend Gordon Corrigan, had to rush here last month, so I thought I'll get here nice and early. I wandered across to the Museum of Yorkshire Life, or just in the park there, and there's a magnificent map of the world and the spread of the Roman Empire, and you could clearly see just by looking at that map, if you want to control the maritime world, then you need the Dardanelles Straits, Gibraltar, and the Suez Canal. They just jump out at me. So within 3 minutes, hopefully, I've convinced you that this cannot just be put in a box marked, waste of time, Churchill's fault, rubbish idea. The caveat on that, Gallipoli does not shorten the war by a day. The Gallipoli Campaign, from its inception to the moment we withdraw, was never likely to win. Okay? So it doesn't shorten the war by a day. I doubt we would ever have been able to achieve what we wanted to achieve in Gallipoli. And yet here I am, 40 years worth of study, saying I'd probably do it again. Because that's, given the other options that are on the table at the time, it's all we were able to do. The answer would not have been to send the men that go to Gallipoli to the Western Front, because they wouldn't have made any impact. There wasn't enough of them. We complained there wasn't enough men in the initial landings anyway. So those few divisions, 2.5 divisions, would not have made a difference on the Western Front. So there is something to being bold, thinking a little bit differently and trying this on. The problem is the order of the way we do things. As you are no doubt, because you're an educated bunch, know, it wasn't our greatest masterstroke when we decided to keep a couple of ships that were being built for the Turkish Navy, that were being built in British dockyards, and we thought we'll keep them and just tell them, you know, they're ours now, and we'll turn them into our own naval ships because we might need them in the upcoming war. This didn't go down well in Turkey, as you know. Germany brilliantly said, have 2 of ours. And we know about the Goeben and the Breslau that were donated by the German Navy, fully crewed, fully manned with military advisors. Latest research is suggesting up to 500 German deaths in the Gallipoli campaign. So it gives you an idea of their involvement. There were a lot more Germans out there than you'd actually realise. But these were fully trained that were able to give the Ottomans the latest advice on how to be fighting against us and the sort of things we're likely to be doing. Royal Navy unsuccessfully chased them down. They made their way in through the Dardanelles Straits, got themselves up into the Black Sea, and actually shifted the balance of power so that the Ottomans had the advantage over the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Bombarded Odessa, Sevastopol, these sort of places. So in retaliation, whilst it's still 1914, the Royal Navy started to bombard the outer ports around the entrance to the Narrows. Some of you may have heard about how we do a couple of landings, Saddlebear Fort, try and blow a few things up. Actually, that's only the half of it. There's almost 20 of these landings that take place where we send troops ashore to take out the ports. One of the most interesting ones, including a guy called Eric Kipper Gascoigne, is awarded a Victoria Cross when he and a group of chaps go ashore dressed in naval whites and actually take out a Turkish battery of mobile guns. And this is another reason why Gallipoli is unlike any other battlefield other than perhaps Palestine in the world, in that the naval guns were on the site of Achilles' Mound, the mythical burial place of Achilles from Troy. So when you go there today, as we probably will be going when we go out on the branch trip, you can imagine what it would have been like to be Kipper Gascoigne there, Robinson, running around in his naval whites. He was described as looking like a bird taking a bath underneath a hose pipe with all of the bullets flying around him, and took out these gun positions. And then you think, hang on a minute, this mound I'm stood on is potentially 2,500 years old or whatever it is, and it's Achilles' burial mound. And there is no sign saying this way to the mound. You literally show a photograph to the local farmer who gets off his tractor and points you in the direction, and there you are. And the gun pits are still there. So we did a lot of this sort of stuff to take out the batteries on the outer entrance to the Dardanelles. Then the Navy tries to force the Narrows in Turkey. It's commemorated every year, the 18th of March. Çanakkale Dardanellspor, the local football team, who are in the 4th division of the Turkish League, currently play in the 18th of March 1915 stadium. Isn't that fantastic? That's far more impressive, isn't it, than the Tesco Arena or something, you know? So that's the day they commemorate. That's what's carved on the hills as you're there. And that naval attempt to force the Narrows was a real missed opportunity in that we'll never know what would have occurred had we gone again on the 19th. My understanding, I feel quite passionate about this, is that de Ruybeck, who's in charge at the time, certainly pushes his chief of staff, Roger Keyes, away from the boardroom when decisions are being made to go and rescue one of our ships that's drifting in. He doesn't want to fall into Ottoman hands, doesn't want the ship to fall into Ottoman hands. So he sends him off to recover this ship. Now he does that because he knows if he'd been in the wardroom when they say we don't go tomorrow, Keyes would have said, yes we do, of course we do, sir. And the Gallipoli campaign is littered with chiefs of staffs being bigger personalities than their actual commanders, and challenging decisions, and sometimes going against what their bosses are saying, which you could say is a good chief of staff in many ways. So they don't go on the 19th, and what that means is we have now lost the chance to land by surprise. And not only that, by the time we do land on the 25th of April, the Ottomans have had a good 6, 7, 8 weeks to prepare for those landings, repair any damage caused, and spread themselves quite thinly, but quite sensibly around the areas we're likely to land. Now, we all know about the Anzac Corps, the Australians landing up to the north around Anzac Cove, you can see, whereas the British units, 29th Division, mainly around the toe here on a series of beaches that we have, X, W, and V, and S beaches that are around there, Y beach about halfway up between the two. And the first day objective of Achi Baba is one that isn't captured for the whole of the campaign. So we never actually reached the first day objective. Since you last went as a branch, which we think is nearly 8 years ago, there's a viewing platform there now. You can stand on top of Achi Baba, and it's like a walk-on map. You can literally point down where all the beaches are, up to Anzac, and the thing that will strike you straight away is the lack of manoeuvrability on the Gallipoli Peninsula. There is nowhere to build up, generate enough force to smash through and to break through. What that means is we get drawn into fighting for the ancient town of Krithia, to give it its Greek name, Alcetepe as it is today, and there are 4 attritional battles in and around Krithia that are very costly. At the same time, the Anzac Corps are trying to re-establish themselves up on the Anzac Heights. They still hope to capture Battleship Hill and Third Ridge, which means you can look down onto the Dardanelles. If you can look down on the Dardanelles, you've pretty much done the job. At no stage was the plan ever to land troops that were going to march triumphantly all the way to Constantinople. Wouldn't have been possible, was never an option. The idea was to land, to outflank the Ottoman guns that are guarding the Narrows, take them out from behind, and then let the Navy have a go again at passing up into Constantinople, where the full might of the Royal Navy will then show the Ottomans that they don't want to mess with us, and eventually they'd surrender and come on our side. That was the sort of general operational stroke strategic decision-making around Gallipoli at the time. Also, that the French influence in this area is far greater than our own and had been for a couple of centuries, so we needed to kind of fall into line what the French wanted to do as well. Certainly didn't want to let them do it on their own. The first time we get realistic reinforcements, which is in the August, we land at Suvla Bay. Why we didn't land there in the first place, we still argue about. That wonderful bay you can see to the north there, like a horseshoe bay. It does mean it's longer to get across to the Dardanelles, but nevertheless, it's a pretty good place for a landing. By the time we get there, the mentality from the Western Front is starting to seep in. And a number of the decisions that are made judged on Western Front doctrine. Things like retirement back to a reverse slope, which is massively important if you're facing the Imperial or the German army with all of their artillery and what have you. We weren't. So if you think about the New Zealanders up the top of Channel Bear, by pulling back to the reverse slope, when the Ottoman counterattack comes in, led by Mustafa Kemal, comes in from your right and pushes you back down the hill. Now, we may not have been able to hold that position if we were on the forward slope, but we'd have seen them come in, and we don't actually know. At the same time, at the Suvla Bay landings, where it was very lightly held by a few Turkish gendarme units and a couple of Ottoman sections on various bits of key ground, we were landing enough men that if we'd have just gone for it, push inland, get that high ground, Anafat Hills, all the way up, we'd have got behind the Turkish gun lines, and again, it would have made a significant difference. However, people tend to instantly blame General Stopford, and he's certainly not short of being blamed, but we should look at his Chief of Staff, Hamilton Reed, Victoria Cross from saving the guns at Galenzo, Western Front experience, who convinces Stopford But any landings, the first thing we need to do is a defensive perimeter for our headquarters, build up our headquarters and start to land stores and supplies before we go forward. Very important, on the Western Front against the Germans, we weren't there. So that sort of doctrine is interfering with a different type of campaign. So it's worth mentioning that right from the get-go. Then we get to the winter, where both sides suffer. We know about the weather in Gallipoli in the winter can be horrific. You know, it's snow, there are storms, it's fairly exposed, certainly up there in Suvla, and we were certainly losing as many men to exposure as we were actually to fighting. So we get to the evacuation, which is often cited as being one of the successful phases of the campaign, arranged like a collapsing bag, the plan for which is something we revisit at the end of Market Garden to get people away from Arnhem. They use the same principles that they taught at Gallipoli, another lesson that will be there for the future for us. And we do manage to slip away. The Australians, 6 weeks before us, which is often 4 weeks before us. 29th Division actually come off at Suvla Bay, re-land at Helles and stayed there for another 4 weeks, which you don't get many Australians mentioning, to be fair. And then, of course, the same 29th Division turn up on the first day of the Somme, July, whereas the Australian units from Gallipoli start to get involved in the August. So it's a pretty quick turnaround for those troops that had come from Gallipoli to get used to the Western Front after the evacuation. One thing that's quite key is, and I'm sure if Rob Thompson was here, he'd be saying the same thing, Gallipoli's about logistics. We're there because of logistics. We're there because our Navy can control the area, and therefore we'll have the upper hand over our main adversaries, even if the Germans get involved. However, once there is a rail line that goes from Berlin to Constantinople, an overland supply line by rail, the Navy become irrelevant to a degree, which is why we really pull off. It's not because of the storm. Certainly there's a lot of people back home saying why we're still in Gallipoli, but actually, now they've got that rail line, once tanks are invented, they'll be able to come down by rail, aircraft can come down by rail, all the latest technology can come down by rail, and the Royal Navy is no longer there to intercept it as such. So it makes sense for us to pull off and fight another day. Now, my bugbear, and I'm very passionate about the Western Front as well, and especially events of 1918, is that often Gallipoli, when compared to the Western Front, is compared to the Western Front in 1918. If you compare Gallipoli with the Western Front in 1915, which you should do, it's not quite as favourable, isn't it, for the Western Front? Because there's not a lot, few things at Neuve-Chapelle that are quite interesting. Ober's Ridge, not great. Is it? Festubert, not great. Luz, not great. We all walked that ground last year. It's not like the answer was waiting for us away from Gallipoli. But if you compare it to 1918, it's a whole different story. And if we look at the Western Front in 1918, of course it starts in the March with the Great Retreat that pushes us all the way back to Villers-Bretonneux. That ends in April 25th, Gallipoli Day, when we finally stop the German advance in the 5th Army sector down at Villers-Bretonneux. And then we turn around and start to come forward again. And people often cite Hamel as being Monash's moment of brilliance, where he comes up with this all-action multi-cap badge operation that means everyone's working for the same thing. They smash through the German lines, capture their positions in 48 minutes or whatever it is, and drive forward. And it is a brilliant operation. And then if you're Canadian, you'll say, well, actually, 8th of August, General Currie, he's the one that really shows the world how to break through on the Western Front with his Amiens operation, which is Monash's plan that's expanded somewhat. I do like to mention that Monash's plan actually comes from a plan that was invented by a guy called Sam Godley, who was the New Zealand commander, who'd practiced this in a field exercise in New Zealand prior to the Great War, about 1912. Aircraft, agricultural vehicles, supporting, bringing up supplies, almost acting in the role of tanks, cavalry skirmish lines, infantry coming up behind, and the artillery in support. So that was a field exercise they had in New Zealand. And of course, Monash and Godley would have been together in Gallipoli when they discussed it. So you could say New Zealand comes up with a plan, which is the point that I always say that Godley is actually from Kent, which is almost southeast London. So Charlton invented a way to win the war. But there is always origins for these great plans when they're claimed. We should also mention that at Hamel, a lot of the guys that were fighting in that would have been Gallipoli veterans, certainly the senior NCOs. Many of them would have been, and many of the officers that would have been commissioned from the ranks, as we see at some of the units involved at Amiens as well. And then there is that fascinating last 100 days of the war, where it's about river crossings, crossing the Canal du Nord, breaking the Hindenburg Line, the Selle River, the Sambre Canal, as well as what's happening in Italy when we're crossing the Piave, all in that period of, 5 to 6 weeks, 7 weeks, when actually we hadn't crossed a river offensively since the Aisne at that stage of the war. So the British Army learns quickly, and each one improves the next one. And that's why those river crossings are so fascinating, the Selle and the Sambre especially. And eventually we get to the armistice is signed. So that's a really successful year for us when we look at it. It's costly in manpower because we're now out of the trenches moving forward. So how much of that was down to Gallipoli men? So let's look at a few of them. I've just picked a few, and they're open to debate. I'm not going to say these guys are absolute legends, and I know there's some of them are controversial figures, but they have their impact. First one you'll all be aware of, Alma Hunter Weston, and there are two schools of thought on him. Some would regard him as a slashing man of action, which was certainly how he came out of the Boer War as his reputation. Others would refer to him as a butcher, because they would think about his control of 9 Corps or certainly his corps on the 1st of July. What we do know is if you take Haig's view of him, he refers to him as a rank amateur after meeting him. But his career is quite interesting. He actually is wounded on the northwest frontier, and he is also on Kitchener's staff in the Nile campaign, so he gets around a bit. He then fights in the Boer War, where he's in charge, or he's the commander of a cavalry column, but his most important thing is when he's in charge of this mounted Royal Engineers that go around behind the Boer lines, destroying their railways, almost using commando tactics against the Boers. Very successful for him. It means he's going to come out of the Boer War in South Africa with a DSO and been mentioned in dispatches. And the report on him says, and I have to read this, it says, reckless courage combined with technical skill and a great coolness in an emergency. That sounds like quite a reasonable commander, doesn't it? Certainly not the Hunter Weston that if you've only read about the Western Front or his performance at Gallipoli, you would have. Haig still refers to him prior to the Great War as being a rank amateur, but that's more to do with which camp he was in. Evelyn Wood's camps over John French's camp, the two there don't really mix too much. By the time the Great War does start, he's initially put in charge of 11 Brigade, which means he's one of the rare Gallipoli men that sees action on the Western Front before the campaign starts. He fights at Le Cateau, which is his first action, and he retreats all the way back to the Aisne, and in fact his units are one of the first to cross the River Aisne and get involved directly in action in a race that they narrowly lose. Up on the Chemin des Dames. Had they managed to get on the Chemin des Dames before the Germans arrive, again, we'd be looking at a different phase of the war there. Intriguingly, as a brigadier, he does this because he gets himself a motorcycle. So you have a brigade commander riding around on a motorbike, very omnipresent. You could say either just what you want to see or probably just what you don't want to see if you're in the front line and a brigadier turns up. But at least he's omnipresent. And then we send him off to Gallipoli. He's not convinced by the plan at all. Before he even gets there, he writes to his wife and says, there's no lack of manoeuvre out here. I don't think there's enough of us. I can't see how this is going to work. But it appears to be almost doctrinal at this stage that if you're a commander in the British Army, you need to project yourself enthusiastically and confidently about what you're about to do, even if you don't believe it yourself. Sounds like modern politics, doesn't it, really? So he's not convinced by the plan. He certainly, you could say that his performance on the landings isn't great. He appears to have completely forgotten anything they would have taught him at Staff College, which is if you can see something the commander can't see, intervene. And certainly Hamilton's even more guilty of that than Hunter Weston, because Hunter Weston spends the entire first day on the Ulysses, which is just off of W&V Beach. And by being just off of there means he cannot see what's happening on the other landing zones. So when troops or officers patrol almost wanders into Krafia at Y Beach and the message comes that there is potential to exploit success there, he's kind of, yeah, but look what's happening in front of me. You know, he gets that tunnel vision of what he can see instead of stepping back and looking at all of the reports and evaluating them. And that's quite significant because when we go to that part of Y Beach, you can see Border Trench, which is where the borders were on the 25th of April, and alongside it, Gurkha Mule Trench, which is famous for the Gurkhas having captured it in the July. So there's between April and July to get to the same spot that we were on the first day of the landings. Then he comes in for more criticism because the way he handles a number of the brigades and divisions under his command for the fighting at Krafia. This famous statement he says about, "Today I blooded the pups," is how he refers to one of the territorial divisions that he throws into the line for the first time that suffer horrific casualties. And that's quite a thing to have levelled at you. It's not this, doesn't show a human side to his command. The flip side to that is that we know under his command we have the Royal Naval Division amongst others, and we do know that by the time we get to the last battles of Krafia, he can see how much artillery support he's got, he can see how much he's likely to achieve, and when you read the orders for these campaigns, they start to say, we're not going to be able to break through here to the fourth line. I think what we're probably best to do is if we just bite hold of that, or bite that bit and hold on to it. Now, many people in the Western Front Association would say, oh, bite and hold. This is Rawlinson on the Somme or Plumer at Messines that invent this wonderful thing. It's being done in Gallipoli. It just takes a lag of 18 months to catch up on the Western Front, really. Or maybe they thought about it in Neuve-Chapelle, but they don't actually pursue it as aggressively as they should do. So bite and hold would come out of that. He actually has a breakdown. He's sent home, which is the parlance of the day for being sacked, really. But he has a breakdown. He's seen wandering off to a hospital ship, makes his way home. And so he spends most of 1916 or back into 15, early 16 recovering. He's then put in charge of the hush-hush scheme. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? I'd love to learn more about this and come and talk to you about it for an hour. It's just really hard finding the resources. I've spent a lot of time in France this last couple of years visiting the area of the Flanders coast, and fascinating to see one of the ideas, which was to manhandle a gun, a large gun, up into the lobby of a hotel that sticks out on the seafront and fire the first salvo of shells through the wall of the hotel, because that way you'd be able to fire all the way up to the Zeebrugge docks without having to land troops. Would have been incredible. Imagine the first round, the ceiling collapses on you and everything. But the hotel's still there, and the hoteliers know nothing about it because they haven't seen the top secret reports or whatever, the odd bit and bob that's kicking around at Kew. But really worth looking at, because hush-hush scheme, was it an actual thing? We don't know. It certainly wasn't called Operation Hush. It was the hush-hush scheme. Was a lot of Gallipoli guys involved. They trusted each other to deliver this. In the end, the nearest it becomes is the Zeebrugge raid, which is another talk that I do about that. Just effectively just a PR exercise, really. It can't achieve too much. The reason it can't achieve too much is because the Dover Patrol, since Roger Keyes has taken over, has already achieved everything that Zeebrugge raid was about to achieve anyway. In that, 21 submarines were leaving each day and returning when Roger Keyes takes over. Amount of submarines sunk by the Dover Patrol, 0. He turns that around with his aggressive policy of convoy coverage and what have you, and fast motor launches to go and take these things on. So by the time we launch Zeebrugge, there's only 8 submarines a day going in and out, and after Zeebrugge, it drops to 6. So it seems hardly worth it. The most outstanding statistic of the Zeebrugge raid is British casualties in the actual raid, nearly 400. German casualties, 8. Yeah? Not 800, 8. There are 9 Victoria Crosses awarded for that, and the raid just down the coast as well, Ostend. So fascinating stuff, hush-hush scheme. Hunter Weston's involved in that. Of course, we know about him commanding on the Somme there, 8th Corps Commander. And then he stands for government, so he becomes one of the few soldiers that is actually elected to Parliament. So as well as having a field command, he's also involved at Westminster. He goes back for a few of the debates on Home Rule in Ireland. He's a Scottish Independent MP at the time. But his most significant contribution is when he gives a talk about the manpower shortages in January, February 1918 as a result of going from 4 battalions down to 3, that sort of thing. And the left-wing press say it was the most brilliant speech of the war. Labour MPs all say this is magnificent, we're going to change our views on this. And he actually goes to Hague and says he's a bit concerned that some of the MPs that have been out visiting the troops have been saying, are you Labour? Because if you are, tell us what's going on, we shouldn't be in this war and that sort of thing. And they were very worried about that sort of struggle from the masses in the trenches to become politicised. Who would blame them with seeing what was happening on the Russian front and to a degree in the German army as a result? So Hunter Weston did a lot to try and quell that sort of thing in 1918 as an MP as well as being out in the field. When he comes back to the last 100 days, he's actually involved in the corps that will go all the way through to Le Quesnoy, or Le Quesnoy, we should say. I watched the Tour de France on the ramparts of that once. Amazing, isn't it? Anyone been there? Wonderful walled city, Vauban fortified city. New Zealanders are facing it on I think it's going to be on the 4th of November when we're doing the Sombra Canal. Whilst I don't think there was World Heritage landmarks at the time, this was regarded as being historically significant, and a bit of a deal was brokered where we were going to go around the town, not actually destroy it because it was so important. The reason it was historically important to the British Army was because it was the very first place that a British soldier came under gunpowder shot in history. So the first time someone wasn't throwing a spear or a sword at you or an arrow, came under fire from the ramparts there. Little known fact. But anyway, very successful operation, very dramatic operation in that they get a big ladder, don't they? And I think it's a guy called Antal, Lieutenant Antal of the New Zealanders, that sticks his head over the top. And at that point, he's the furthest forward man of the British Expeditionary Force. Looks left and looks right and sees the German machine gun just swinging there where the crew have seen some movement and cleared off. You know, and eventually they go into the town, a little bit of scrapping, but the town is saved. Rather sadly, he dies in 1940 when he falls from, it's not a council house this, when he falls from the turret of his house. How many people here have got turrets on their houses? So he falls from the turret. It's a very sad way for him to die, really. At that stage, they think he's worth around about £2 million in money, so that's a lot of money by this time. But Hunter Weston, Gallipoli onto the Western Front. Here's one you'll know as well, Freiburg, Bernard Freiburg, fascinating character. The clues are all there for us pretty much before he even joins the army. He actually trains to be a dentist initially, born in London, well, Richmond, and then moves out to New Zealand when he's a youngster, trains to be a dentist, but decides to go off to America. Whilst he's in Los Angeles, he decides to sign up and fight with Pancho Villas in the Mexican campaign against the Americans. Next time you'll sort of like do the white man van version of Pershing and say, oh yeah, Pershing is that one, he wouldn't hand the Americans over to the Brits, would he? Well, that's kind of because a lot of us have been shooting at him, to be fair, in Mexico. And there are 3 or 4 divisional commanders that go on to become divisional commanders on the Western Front that had fought in Mexico and fought against the Americans. So that little black book of Persians probably remembered him. I remember you. You're a freedom fighter. He stayed in America until 1914, and when he learnt that war had been declared, he needed to get back to enlist to Britain straight away. And so to do this, he needs to raise some cash. He wins a swimming competition that gets him from Los Angeles across to New York. He's happy with that. What can I do now? He enters and wins a prize fight in New York, and that manages to get him enough money to get the ship back to London. When he gets to London, he decides he wants to enlist now. He doesn't want to hang around. And it wasn't easy to enlist in the army in London in 1914. I have some wonderful stories about recruiting centres where just because there's so many of us that, you know, you go down to Tower of London to join and suddenly the queue goes all the way back up, you know, back up towards the Aldwych. You think, well, this is a waste of time. You go off to the guards and guards are like, we're not taking any Kitchener volunteers. I know one story in particular of a load of golfers that decided to form a golfing unit, professional golfers and their caddies. They get turned away from all these places and they give up the ghost. They decide to go to a restaurant somewhere like Quaglino's, and whilst they're there waiting to be served, they hear on another table, a load of blokes get up and run off, and they say, well, where are they going? Oh, they're on their way to the station, Paton station. Apparently, they're recruiting troops down in Wiltshire and no one lives there. Oh, we'll have some of that. So all they go, and the poor old bloke in this Wiltshire, Salisbury or whatever, sat there, recruiting sergeant. Suddenly the train comes in from London, thousands of people get off. Who are you then? Rifle Brigade. Oh, that'll do. We'll join you lot, So a little bit exaggerated, but Freiburg wanted to get involved in the action. Now, a good way to do that is to volunteer for the Royal Naval Division that was being created at the time. It means he also gets to Western Front before he gets to Gallipoli because he's at Antwerp. Not the finest moment of the Royal Naval Division, and I'm a fan of theirs. And again, I say that with reticence because my uncle served in the Royal Naval Division in Hawk Battalion. Because when they land, they obviously take a bit of a wrong turn. And who's in the Royal Navy here? Bit of a... Yeah, I mean, not known for map reading, to be fair, Charts, perfect, but map reading. And so they wander into Holland and get interned for most of the war, don't they? A few of them get out. One of those that gets out is Freiburg. They reconstitute the number of the units and get sent down to the Dardanelles. At that stage, not involved in the initial landings as such, but on his way down, we should say this is where Rupert Brooke takes a bite and gets infected and dies of blood poisoning and what have you. And Freiburg was one of the men that was a pallbearer at Rupert Brooke's funeral there on Skyros. He decides he does want to get involved on the first day. So being a good swimmer, he goes ashore the other side of the Kilitbeer Ridge, and he sort of swims ashore, throwing around pyrotechnics on the beach, wakes up all of the local Turks who think this is where the attack's taking place. They start sending reserves to the area, and as a result of that, he's awarded a Distinguished Service Order. He actually swims back out where a submarine picks him up, or a little ship or something, and away he goes. So a one-man invasion. Incredible stuff, isn't it? Why is it not Victoria Cross? He's the only one there. No one's seen him. So he's going on his own account, isn't it? So DSO it is. He stays on the Gallipoli Peninsula for the whole of the campaign, and eventually when he comes off of Gallipoli, he's now the commander of Hood Battalion, and he eventually is awarded his Victoria Cross on the Somme on the Ancre Valley, night of 13th, 14th November 1916. Briefly, he leaves his beloved Royal Naval Division because he's offered a brigade command. He takes it. It's of a second-line territorial division, 58th London, who are a very good division, actually. Only recently someone's written a history of them, so they've been overlooked for a long time. But a very efficient division. He was a brigade commander with them up in the Ypres salient around the Totem Mole area, pushed towards Pole Capelle. He's wounded and refuses to go to the dressing station until he can see his men are on their objectives. So, he's one of these commanders that really does lead from the front, Freiburg. And that's obviously at Passchendaele. Now, the reason I mention that is because he's the only man I can think of who actually saves lives in another war as a result of his experiences in the First World War. Because the story is that when we go to, obviously not as stellar commander in the Second World War, is actually an example of a Victoria Cross doesn't necessarily make you a great commander. But in the Second World War, at one stage in Italy, General Alexander, who's the overall commander, brings in Oliver Leese, who's one of his corps commanders, and Freiburg, who's one of his corps commanders, and they decide they're going to attack Monte Cassino town again. And they said, we've tried this, sir, it's a complete waste of time. We've got to do it, the RAF are on their way, this is going to happen. Gives them their orders, it finishes just early enough so he's able to say, right, I haven't got long, gents, so one word. And Freiburg says, Passchendaele. And the three of them think about it, and that attack doesn't go in. And the next one that does is a lot better planned and actually involves the breakout of the Leary Valley. So how many people's experiences in World War I affect their decision-making in World War II? Freiburg is one of those from that. He eventually then takes over 88th Brigade, which he's thrilled about because they are 29th Division, so he's back with his Gallipoli pals. And it's an incredible story, this. On the 11th of November, at 10:55, he decides to take part in a mounted charge with the 7th Dragoon Guards to capture a bridge, which he realises is probably going to be significant logistically for them if the armistice is signed and they're on the far bank as opposed to the home bank. So off they go into this charge. They actually capture around about 90 prisoners, I believe, at which point the Germans say, you do know it's 11:01, right? And he says, not by my watch, 10:59. And they argue this thing out, and the poor old Germans go in the bag for about a year, and he's awarded a DSO. It's got to be one of the last awards of the war. Cavalry charge, 10:55 it sets off. Yeah, and the Germans, a bit like having a Russian linesman in the World Cup, complained that the watches were wrong and they should have all been released. Here's one favourite of yours, David, of course. Walter Pippin Braithwaite, and originally joins the Somerset Light Infantry. Doesn't stay with them for too long. Somerset Light Infantry is with those in the Boer War. And he's mentioned dispatching the Boer War, actually. Fights at some really impressive spots, Spion Kop being one of the most significant sites. If you're thinking about going to South Africa, I mean, it really is a fantastic place to visit. And as much as, we love to go to Rorke's Drift and recreate the film Zulu word for word when we're on the ground, the Boer War side of it, if you're a Great War person, I can't tell you how rewarding it is, because I went as, I didn't guide it, I went because I'm lucky enough to own a tour company, so I took a spare place and went on it, and I had all these authorities on the Boer War that they only know about the Boer War. I'm sure that's a generalisation for those of you on the World Wide Web if it's going live, but generally the Boer War is their subject, and from 1902 they kind of lose interest. So you literally have these guys that know every single thing about Boer War saying, yeah, and then some bloke called Haig was over there, I don't know what happened to him. But every time they mentioned an officer, I was going, is that so-and-so, divisional commander? I don't know, mate. Look him up, and it was. So it's fascinating from us as Great War people to study the South Africa War, because you're seeing these guys set off on their journeys to their career. And so someone like Braithwaite, who'd been at Spion Kop, which wasn't a success, but actually Tugular Heights, a few months later, that was, put him in good stead. And then when he comes back from South Africa, he goes to Staff College as an instructor. And then he goes to Quetta to take over the Staff College at Quetta. So all of the Indian Army Staff College trained officers are being trained by Braithwaite. So a very influential person with regards to what's going to be happening in the Great War, because a lot of those staff officers have gone through under his instructorship. He's Hamilton's Chief of Staff, as we know, throughout the Gallipoli Campaign. I don't think it's an adequate command. I think there are times when he could have been a bit more forceful with Ian Hamilton and said, sir, we need to be doing this now. When he perhaps doesn't, lets Hamilton go off on the way he's going. But 1916 is a really important year for Braithwaite, and actually a really tragic year for us as well as him, because when he loses his son on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, as you know, Valentine's killed with the Somersets, isn't he, just outside of Serre, that's his only son. And the tragedy is, it's at that point that he burns all of his family papers. So a lot of the stuff is missing about that early time, and a lot of his decision-making, his thought process in Gallipoli that would be fascinating for us to know now have been lost partly because of the loss of his son. He's given a bit of a new purpose when they give him command of 62nd West Riding Division. Certainly one of my favourite, if you can have favourite divisions, but one of my divisions that I do like to follow on the Western Front, superb division. And throughout 1917 they're successful, but, Bullecourt's trying for them. But really, we go back to that opening shot, and you saw those guys crossing the Rickerval Bridge. By that stage of the war, Braithwaite is a corps commander. This falls under his remit. So perhaps the most magnificent moment of victory, which is, crossing that bridge intact, and one that I found particularly interesting because it's the only time we can compare and contrast British, Americans and Australians on the same day, over the same ground, against roughly the same enemy. It's a Gallipoli man that's calling the shots at corps level. So that's very important. And in fact, the photograph you can see there, not the one of his image, but he stood in the box behind, that's the unveiling of the 62nd West Riding Division memorial there on the edge of Havering Court Wood. After the war, the first job he was given was actually to write a report on staff work in the Great War. How good was the staff work? And even though he'd been involved in some of that staff work, the report of staff work actually is quite favourable to the way the staff conducted themselves throughout the war. It's quite an important thing. It's still studied today as a document about, how did we get on with it. If you're writing about staff papers, you need to look at the Braithwaite report. But he comes across overly, it's quite complimentary to the way the staff was in the Great War. And then after the war, he becomes the head of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for a few years, and then takes the job at Royal Hospital Chelsea, which again is quite a nice position for him to be in. And he also has a key role in planning for Haig's funeral, before eventually he passed on in 1943, is it? 45? In the way there, 1945. This guy, does anyone know about this guy before? Sir William Elliot Paton. You're not related to him, are you? Whoever said that? Because he's someone I'm really keen on, actually, what he becomes and where he comes from. His father commanded the 7th Dragoon Guards. He fails the entrance test to go to Sandhurst. So he joins via the ranks, makes his way up to sergeant, and then eventually gets himself commissioned. He fights in Sudan, very severely wounded, spear. I mean, this is a proper wound, isn't it? A spear wound that kills the horse from underneath him. I mean, you need to repeat those things from time to time because it shows how we go from colonial wars into, effectively industrial war, don't we? So spear kills the horse from underneath him. When he goes to the Boer War, and Sudan that is as well, Battle of Omdurman, all that sort of stuff. Fascinating, isn't it? Goes to the Boer War and he gets himself part of Thornycroft's mounted infantry. Now, these are quite a key unit. They come up time and time again, privately raised, volunteers that go out mounted and again get up close and personal wherever they can with the Boers. Very, very important in that they're some of the first ones up at Spionkop and get pushed off of Spionkop and don't realise the opportunities are ahead of them, unfortunately. But by the time he's mentioned dispatch a number of times, and he's actually the head of ceremonies by the time we get to the Delhi Durbar, which is why he's wearing that rather splendid outfit that I wanted to put on today until it was going to be live broadcast, and I thought it might clash with the camera. But let's look at that wonderful gold leaf stuff there. That's him at the Delhi Durbar, and because of his experience as a mounted troop, he then drops back to the yeomanry units as an in-charge brigade commander of a yeomanry brigade in perhaps one of the most fascinating parts of the Gallipoli Campaign, and strangely, the one that many itineraries I look at don't include. So if I say we are going to be including it, which is the significant battle of the 21st of August, where they try and catch between Chocolate, Simiter Hill, and break through to Anafarta. It's actually the largest land battle of the Gallipoli Campaign as well. So it's amazing that we don't visit it very often. It's just off the beaten track. Well, we tend to. And it's a complete chaos because the yeomanry's role on the day was actually to cross the Salt Lake under fire, in daylight, in waves, not on horseback, in waves, get to the newly won hills that had been captured by the 29th Division and hold them. So they cross the Salt Lake, I should say, just before they're about to start. The commanding officer is taken elsewhere. So one of the brigade commanders has been put in charge of the division, and then battalion commander put in charge of brigade, and all this happens on the day of the attack. So there's a lot of confusion, but they cross the Salt Lake under fire, and when they arrive to say to the 29th Division, well done, you've captured Simiter Hill, where do you want us to put our outposts? The report comes, actually the attack's failed, in half an hour you're going to go and try it yourselves. And you've got the big Simiter Hill, and the way the landscape is there is you can't just rush over the top. So within about half an hour, they come up with a plan to send 2 brigades to the left, 1 to the right, and make their way up on it. And incredibly, they do reach Simiter Hill 4 times throughout the day. But the Ottomans, the Turks, realise how that is the key ground, if not the vital ground in the whole of the Suvla Plain. Whoever controls Simiter Hill controls that sector. Very obvious to us when we get out there in a few months' time, those of you that come in. And so they put in counterattack after counterattack and eventually push us off of Simiter Hill, so close to being a success. 3 of the brigade commanders killed in that action. Quite incredible, really. Brigadier generals being killed, leading them into the front. I was trying to think of the actor, The Moon's a Balloon. What's his name? Of course, David Niven's father killed in that action as well with the Berkshire Yeomanry. And Lord Longford being one of the brigadiers that's killed on that day as well. Then they go off to fight in the equally fascinating campaign in, say, Palestine campaign. Doesn't go down too well when we visit the area today because it's all fought in Israel. But the campaign in Palestine, absolutely fascinating. Don't know if you know about HMS Tara. Incredible thing. This thing is torpedo, I think, and drift ashore, and the crew are captured by anti-British Arabs for quite some time. And when news reaches us that they're still alive, but they're kept in the middle of the desert and they're starving and things aren't going very well, William Elliot Paton, along with his mate, the Duke of Westminster, decide to get in some armoured cars and go and rescue them. And they tear across the desert in armoured cars and rescue these guys. They're just about to give up. Their fuel's really low, and they're trying to navigate using the stars when they just come across this Bedouin camp almost by chance in the right place, right time, and rescue all these crew of HMS Tara. Incredible stuff, isn't it? Real boys like the cover of Victor magazine comic, that would be, at a place called Bir Hakeim. And then from that incredibly fascinating aspect of the war, we move on to what sounds like the dullest thing in the world, the military secretaries branch in France. But those of you who've been on tour with me before know this is equally as fascinating. And any of you that have listened to John Bourne talk about them, the tiger hunters, as they were called, realise this is a key thing. One of the best things Haig does in the war, really, to come up with this military secretaries branch in France, which effectively takes away the responsibility of appointing commanders, because Haig himself finds out when he takes over from Sir John French that one of his division, I think most of the divisional staff, what links them is they all belong to the same golf course in Africa before the war, right? So military secretaries branch, their job is to appoint people on ability, not on whether they get on with the person they're working with or not. It takes away this annual report that you had before you, whereas how many in here of you have fallen out with your boss before at work, which may well mean you're never going to go through that ceiling because you don't get on with your boss. That's what's happening in the army as well at the time. That's taken away because these guys are scoped and they highlighted from a very junior captain level, major level, and think, we'll keep our eye on him. Any report of his unit, let's see what he's doing, and then that's how we start to appoint people. So a massively important role, really successful role, and when you look at them, the people that were in them, you have people like Paton. I think there's one guardsman. I don't think there are any rifle brigade or Kingsford Rifle Corps. They're all what you would unfairly regard as fish and chip battalions, regiments or whatever. In fact, the only other guy that would be of note is the Royal Engineer meteorological officer that lights his cigarette at loose. Is one of the guys, you remember that when he sees which way, whether they're going to release the gas or not, I forget his name, but he's one of the guys in it as well. Actually, what links them all is they're not rich. They're not seriously rich. They're so ridiculously rich that they are going to be making decisions based on ability, not on their own position. So if Haig was ever to say, my dear Sir William, I don't like that new corps commander you've sent me, can you change him? He'll say, no. Oh, and by the way, if you don't like that decision, I'll just leave your war, I'll go back to owning Leicestershire. Is that all right? Bye, So, whereas other people might say, oh, blimey, I don't want to upset the general, I better do as he said, or the field marshal. So really important, independent control of promotion, and that's someone that Paton's very much involved with, and here we find this Gallipoli man. And then rather bizarrely, the last 100 days of the war, we find him as an army commander, a corps commander, and a divisional commander, all in the last 100 days. But instead of going from division to corps to army, he actually goes the other way around. And not because he's being busted, far from it, it's because the further he comes down, the more involved he gets. So just to give you an idea of how that works, when he takes over the 5th Army, he takes it over in late April 1918. There is no 5th Army. It's cadre strength. It's been wiped out. And he's the man that replaces Gough initially until they sort it out. So all he's got is a few instructors and a few cadres and little bits of a unit. So then he goes to a corps, but that corps is one that's being held in reserve. He didn't like this much at all. So actually, he goes to take over the 40th Division, the Bantam Division, the one that had been involved in the attack on Boulogne Wood. And in the last 100 days, they're extremely active, and he leads them victory after victory after victory, all the way through to the last 100 days. Eventually dies in 1931. What an incredible story. What an incredible character. This one, does anyone know about this guy? Heard about him before? George Raymond Dallasmore. We'll certainly hear about him when we get out to Gallipoli. He's of British descent, born in Australia. His father was working out there as a diplomat at the time. His father was an ex-officer in the served in the Hampshire Regiment, but they send him back to the UK to finish his education, and his mum goes with him to make sure that education is okay. He goes to a school on the Isle of Wight. I think he's on his way to Clifton or somewhere down in the West Country. War's declared, and he decides to enlist in straight away. Enlists in the ranks, sends a telegram off to his dad saying, "Dad, you'd be really proud of me. I've joined up in the Devonshires, I think 7th or 8th Devons, maybe 9th, whichever way he could well have been if he'd have stayed there, you know, on the first day of the Somme there at Devonshire Trench. But either way, the response he gets back isn't from his dad saying, "I'm so proud of you, son." It's like, "What have you done?" Not what have you done for joining the army so young, because he's only 17, but what have you done joining a regiment like the Devons? You know, you should join my old regiment, go and see this man in London. So off he trots to London, sees the honorary colonel of the Hampshires, and I'm obviously playing this story up a bit, but it's kind of knocks on the door. "Who are you, Moore? Are you like your father?" "Yes, welcome to the regiment." He's in. When he lands at Gallipoli at 17, he's the youngest officer we're aware of that lands in the Gallipoli Campaign. Less than 4 weeks later, he's the most experienced officer left in his battalion. All right. There is an incident that occurs in the June, it's about the 19th of June, I think it is, where an area of trenches that were being held, 42nd Division units, just newly in theatre, had been taken over sectors of the line. One of the Manchester battalions had unfortunately lost the trench, and he decides to recapture that trench using men of the 29th Division, and he manages to get just at the right time, on the right spot, to stop the retirement of the Manchesters, hold the line, steady the trench. And I have a letter that will be taken with us to Gallipoli, written by a staff officer. It's the most fantastic thing. One day I'm going to have it published. Partly because the guy who writes the letter gets killed before he finishes the letter and just ends with a full stop. I think that's when he goes up the line, he never comes back to write it again. But he mentions so many key things in there. And one of the things he mentions is, "I'm just about to write up all the decorations. There were many brave men the other day." He said, "One poor young lad called Moore. I arrived on the scene just in time. He was dead beat and rambling, and I stopped him from going off his head. He was a very brave young fellow." And that's the only time that mention appears in anything, is in this letter I've got. Now, why that's important is because we know the Beverley Usher, the man who wrote that letter, is the guy's going to put him in for the award. And the award, when you read the Victoria Cross action, is one of holding the line, sending up some reserves, taking a situation that was dangerous. But when you read Bouvard de Lisle's account, he'll point out that actually that he'd had to shoot some of the Manchesters that were fleeing the trenches. And when you read the divisional account, it actually talks about shooting dead men that were fleeing. That's quite controversial, isn't it? There's no doubt he saved the situation, but he actually shot some of our guys on the way back. It's really easy for us to judge it 100 years on, so I don't judge the actions. I perhaps question the award of a VC for those actions. It's a strange one, isn't it? Undoubtedly a brave guy. If we pick him up in France in 1918, by now he's 20, 21, maybe 20, yeah, maybe 21. We also see him with an MC and a bar. One for September 1918 and one for October 1918. First one for daylight reconnaissance on his own. The second one for again on reconnaissance, but seeing a situation, manages to rally the troops around him and capture the position without shooting some of his own men. So a very highly decorated guy. So you've now got Victoria Cross, MC and bar, effectively 4 years combat experience, still a second lieutenant, and never in command of men. Would stayed on Bouvard de Lisle's staff for the whole of the war. I think that's hugely telling, that he's never promoted, never given command again. Sadly, he's not around, well, he wouldn't be anyway, but he wasn't around to tell his story at the end of the war, because like so many, he catches the flu pandemic or general wearing down, whatever it was, and he's buried in Bois Grenier Cemetery. I think it's Y Farm. So if you ever go in there and Y Farm at Bois Grenier, you see the Victoria Cross, and we always go over and say, "Oh, this is an interesting story." Think about this. Absolutely fascinating character. George Raymond Dallas Moore. What experiences for someone that age, eh? Okay, the Worcestershires. We all know about this, right? In the middle there, Gallipoli. You've all been there before, no doubt. The chateau at Gallipoli, Worcester's bayonet charge, across the chateau grounds to relieve the hard-pressed South Wales borderers. Not so many people are aware that on the 26th, late afternoon on the 25th of April 1915, the 4th Worcesters, under the charge of command of Lieutenant Colonel Cayley, actually do an equally gallant bayonet charge from the top of W Beach across the Helles lighthouse positions that eventually cause the Ottomans to pull back and allow us to successfully land at V Beach. Now, we all know about 2 Victoria Crosses awarded, rushing up the hill to the castle to break out of V Beach. None of that would be possible, in my view, without the Worcester's bayonet charge in daylight across open ground into the Ottoman troops. It was a magnificent bayonet charge led by Lieutenant Colonel Cayley. If we fast forward to 1918, and this time we're now in, I think, September, October 1918, we've got to recapture the Ypres salient. What's the key to the Ypres salient, we all know, is actually the plateau, Gallipoli Plateau still. Most of 1917, most of 1914, even the battles in 15 and 16 were up and down that Menin Road, weren't they? But actually, to come from the right flank, from the Mezines direction, is the most direct route. It doesn't have the roads, the MSRs, that sort of thing for supply, but it's the most direct route. So in 1918, logistically, we're in a different world. We're also fighting out in the open. So who is it that's going to attack Gallipoli in 1918? It's going to be the 29th Division, Gallipoli men. They are now commanded by Major General Cayley, who's a Worcester, who happened to be the battalion commander at Gallipoli in their bayonet charge, who also knows that Gallipoli was captured by the Worcesters at the point of bayonet back in October 1914. So he says, I've just a battalion under my command to recapture Gallipoli. We're going to send the 4th Worcesters in, and they're going to go the shortcut way, which is a lot better. And they do it. Incredible action. They cover ground that you wouldn't dream of in 1916-17, speed and efficiency. And they're actually led at that stage by a chap called Hackett, Captain Hackett. Wouldn't say he's the most Oxbridge-educated man, because his own account says, beating the nearest Bosch gunner over the head with my stick, asking what the blank, blank, blank he meant by loosing off blank, blank machine guns at me, right? Now, the clue there is that it's actually Captain Hackett, DCM, MM, commissioned from the ranks. He'd been a sergeant with Cayley at Helles in the bayonet charge in 1915, and then he leads the capture of Gallipoli in 1918. I mean, it's incredible for the Worcesters, isn't it? 3 of those bayonet charges, twice over the same ground. And when you read the orders for that, I just want to reinforce this thing about what is the Gallipoli spirit? Why was it so important to them, even when they get to the Western Front? This is 1918, it says, the division is more than a memory, it is alive. It marches on. It fights today in France. Even during the Gallipoli Campaign, the personnel of the division passed away and was thrice renewed. But in each case, those who fell out bequeathed their spirit to those who took up their places. Gallipoli stays with them. And when you look at the orders for the attack here at Ypres, there's no doubt at all that you see it constantly referenced, is they refer to our old friends, the Royal Naval Division on one side, our old friends, the New Zealanders on the other, and they are the 29th Division. They've got their Gallipoli order of battle back, but now they're on the Western Front, and it stayed with them throughout the whole of the war. Very brief one, because this is one of the guys you'll find out the least amount. It doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Disgraceful, isn't it? Thinking even I've got one somewhere. Anyway, Brigadier Archibald Herbert Leggett. He commanded the 156th Brigade of the Lowland Division. Again, he'd been at Colenso in the Boer War, the DSO there. At that stage, he briefly served with the West York. So even though he's a Brit but served his whole life, well, born in England, but is a Scotsman by belief and what have you, served his whole life in Scottish regiments, briefly with the West Yorks. Instructor at Sandhurst, one of the few that goes off and serves with the Japanese army in the Russo-Japanese War, gets lots of experience about modern war. We use the The Boer War is our last real combat experience of a massive nature. Anything we pick up from Russia, Japan's important. He's one of those guys who would know that. Lands with the 1st 5th Royal Scots Fusiliers in June 1915 at Crofia. Wounded a couple of times, but stays throughout the Gallipoli Campaign with them. 1917, goes off to Palestine. So South Africa, Gallipoli, Russo-Japanese War, Palestine. Whilst he's there, he's involved in Gaza, the battle for Jaffa. It's also charging around the desert, and very, very important. A lot of the 52nd Division stuff there in Palestine is fascinating. But in August 1918, they're then brought to France, and he serves as part of the 3rd Army. That brigade and that division serves alongside New Zealanders, 42nd East Lancs and 63rd Royal Naval Division. All Gallipoli divisions, now they're on France on the Western Front. And he's actually awarded a bar to his DSO the day before the war ends, just on the outskirts of Mons there, a place called Hertchies. To add to that, he's awarded a CMG, 4 mentioned in dispatches, and he's only a lieutenant colonel. His brigade is honorary awarded to him at the end of the war. So all that as a lieutenant colonel. Quite incredible, isn't it? And what fascinating lives these guys saw, the different climates they fought in. The quotes on him say that he had a deep knowledge of warfare and a natural aptitude for arms. He had an abundance of common sense. Now, I would say common sense is one thing that we need in the army, and certainly need it in the Western Front. Last character I'll speak about, a local guy, Lieutenant Colonel William Ralph Peel, DSO and bar. There he is impressively on his horse. This is taken a lot earlier. You can see him there, second one up on your right. Now, his Gallipoli involvement's important. It's with the 5th Yorks. Kitchener's army's entrance into overseas warfare before someone from Hartlepool attacks me saying, we came out of fire first, right? It's not at the Battle of Losers, you know, it's actually at the landings of Suvla Bay. And on the 6th of August, these guys here fight a magnificent action at Lullababa. Lullababa, that's the hill of it. If you read Colonel Chapman's account of it, it's just phenomenal. One of the best things I did in the centenary was to be there on the 100th anniversary, just myself, Steve Chambers and Rory Stevens, no passengers, 3 of us as guides, reading his account of the action, where he says, you know, we went 2/3 up the hill, when gaping before us appeared an Ottoman trench. We then stride 10 paces further forward and found a second one, and we were finding them. It was absolutely incredible. It felt you could touch history when we were out there. So I was always very fond of that unit in particular and what they achieved. For Kitchener's army, it's easy to level at them. They were untrained, inexperienced troops. But their performance on the initial landings was as good as any regular battalion would have been able to have achieved. He's promoted, and he then takes over the Manchesters. He commands the 10th Manchesters for the rest of the war, which is where he's awarded his DSO and bar. Of course, you probably already recognise the name. I think it's his great-grandfather that forms the Metropolitan Police, when we call the Peelers. In the last 100 days, 10th Manchester's very, very active, and he's involved just outside Mons again, where they capture a bridge into the town and liberate the town. All the locals coming out and cheering as they liberate the town, all this sort of thing. And the award of the DSO, the ribbon only, because the medals weren't there, was pinned on by the mayor under the bandstand the day after, you know, the armistice was declared. And there's some lovely photographs of him, you know, stood under this bandstand with the whole battalion. One of the streets in the town is named after him and everything. It's a magnificent little vignette of the last days of the war and William Peel. And of course, the punchline is the reason that I'm interested in him is because I own his trench maps. So they are all his maps that he carried throughout France on the Western Front. So if you want to come and touch a bit of history, by all means do so. And certainly one with a Yorkshire connection in that he was part of those Howards that landed. So I'll need to read from the screen from this one, I'm afraid, Mr. Cameraman, but there we are. This is to sum up. 1918, 5 armies in the British Army at the time. 3 of them had been commanded by men who'd served in Gallipoli. 4, if we count Paton as well. Okay, so Horn, Bing and Birdwood. 5 of the corps commanders that are heavily involved in the last 100 days are commanded by Gallipoli men. Hunter Weston, Godley, Beauvoir de Lisle, Braithwaite and Monash. 9 of the divisional commanders of the most heavily engaged divisions in the advance to victory last 100 days are commanded by men who'd seen service in Gallipoli. And there we see Cayley, Paton, Russell, Duncan, Girdwood, Glasgow, Smith VC, Gellibrand, and Hamilton Lister Reed. There is no doubt that the men of Gallipoli have their involvement in the last 100 days of the war. And no one is more relevant in what happens with victory than this guy, actually. This is Admiral of the Fleet, Roslin Erskine Weems. Now, I've had to teach myself to say that, because when I was a kid, we used to have a school in Blackheath called Wemyss Road School. So we all called him, it was named after him, so every in South East London, we'd all call him Admiral Wemyss, because that's how we say the school name, but I believe his name is actually Weems. Distinguished Service Order, is in charge of the 12th Battle Squadron throughout his time at Gallipoli. He was heavily involved in Palestine, including encouraging an Arab revolt, where Weems acted as godfather until the Arabs were back on their feet. So very like some more celebrated celebrities that were involved in the campaign with the Arabs. Weems has his role as well. He was hugely involved in the Zeebrugge raid in 1918, and then he's the man in the railway carriage at the signing of the armistice. So even when we're in the middle of that wonderful clearing in the forest, when you go to the railway carriage, the only British representative in that carriage was Weems, who was a Gallipoli man. So it doesn't end when they leave Gallipoli. So I always like to point out, the Gallipoli men do not win the war, but it would have been a lot harder to have won the war without them. So with that, I'll take any questions or a break or whatever you'd like.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
I know where he is. If you want to find the private, I know where he is.